Hello and welcome. In this lecture, you will be learning developing an enterprise architecture. Our objectives are the following. Understand the purpose of an EA methodology within the EA program. Understand the steps of an example EA methodology. The establishment of an EA program has many facets, and one of the keys to success is to use a detailed documentation methodology to get the program started, and then to guide the EA documentation effort. The EA methodology described in this book is generalized so it can be used in a wide variety of public and private sector enterprises and can support many types of EA frameworks, tools, and repositories. Depending on the type of enterprise, some parts of the EA methodology may need to be changed. It is important to develop an EA methodology as one of the first steps in establishing the EA program because it forces the enterprise to think through the following important considerations. The 20-step process presented on the following pages is on this slide and the following slides is an example EA implementation methodology that contains all of the general steps that would support the creation of a new comprehensive EA program. It should be noted that the revitalization of an existing EA program will involve additional steps that will vary with every or each situation. Revitalization could focus on the selection of a different AA framework and implementation methodology, and or the identification of new vertical and horizontal partitions of the enterprise that is being documented, segments and crosscuts. Phase 1 is about EA program establishment. It involves the following steps. Step 1, establish the EA management program and identify a chief architect. Step 2, establish an EA implementation methodology. Step 3, establish EA governance and links to other management processes. Step 4, develop an EA communication plan to gain stakeholder buy-in. Phase 1 activities are designed to get the EA program initially started. Identify key players and communicate the EA implementation plan to the executive sponsor and other stakeholders in order to gain buy-in and support. These pre-documentation activities are important to ensuring that the EA program has clear goals, remains focused, and is accepted throughout the enterprise. Phase 2 is EA framework and tool selection. It involves step 5, select an EA documentation framework. Step 6, identify EA lines of business or crosscuts and the order of their documentation. Step 7, identify the EA components to be documented framework-wide. Step 8, select documentation methods appropriate for the framework. Step 9, select software applications, tools to support automated EA documentation. Step 10, select and establish an online EA repository for documentation and analysis. Phase 2 activities take place when the initial set of EA documentation is developed. This begins with the selection of an EA documentation framework that will identify the scope of the architecture, guide the techniques for the modeling of current views, develop future scenarios and associated modeling, and establish an online EA repository that will archive all of the EA documentation artifacts. Phase 3 is documentation of the EA. Step 11, evaluate existing business and technology documentation for use in the EA. Step 12, document current views of existing EA components in all framework areas, levels, or threads. Store artifacts in the online repository. Step 13, develop several future business technology operating scenarios. Step 14, identify future planning assumptions for each future scenario. Step 15, use the scenarios and other program or staff input to drive the documentation of future EA components in all framework areas. Store artifacts in the online EA repository. Step 16, develop an EA management plan to sequence planned changes in the EA. The phase 3 activities are where the actual development of the EA occurs in the form of documentation artifacts. This involves analyzing and documenting the current strategy, business, information, services, and infrastructure of the enterprise. It also involves the development of artifacts that reflect changes in resources in the short term and development of a group of long-term future scenarios to identify possible courses of action and resource changes that would be needed in response to different internal and external influences. The activities in this phase of the EA documentation methodology conclude with the development of an EA management plan that summarizes the current and future views of the architecture and provides a transition and sequencing plan for short-term and long-term changes. Phase 4 is the use and maintain of the EA. Step 17, use EA information to support planning and decision making. Step 18, regularly update current and future views of EA components. Step 19, maintain an EA repository for modeling and analysis products. Step 20, release annual updates to the EA management plan. Phase 4 is an ongoing set of activities that promotes the use of EA information by all stakeholders and establishes an annual cycle for updates. This is where the value of the EA program is realized as planning and decision making throughout the enterprise are supported. This value is maintained through regular updates of the current and future views of the architecture. Value is also gained in the maintenance of the EA repository and the maintenance of all associated software licenses for modeling and archiving.